If you had asked any of John Haigh's acquaintances to describe him, they might have used terms such as handsome, intelligent, well-dressed, altogether a respectable member of his community. While this was the image he outwardly projected, in reality he was a liar, a fraud, and a brutal killer who would dissolve his victims in acid. Born in Stamford, England on July 24, 1909, John George Haigh was raised in the tiny village of Outwood by his parents John and Emily Haigh. Due to the fact that John had no siblings nor close childhood friends, and his mother and father kept themselves to themselves, most of what we know of his early years is based on John's own statement, which may not have been the most trustworthy. We do know that the Haigh household was not exactly affluent, but neither poverty-stricken. John Sr. and Emily belonged to a highly conservative and anti-modern Protestant sect known as the Plymouth Brethren, and constantly reminded their son that God was observing his every move. Whenever little John did or was planning to do something he was not supposed to, his father would say, "Do not grieve the Lord by behaving so," or "It would not please the Lord." Allegedly, John Sr. lived for the idea of the hereafter and viewed the world as corrupted and evil. He even built a wall between 6 and 8 feet tall around the house to separate the family from other villagers who the Haighs saw as inferior. Because of his parents' beliefs, John grew up in seclusion with his pet and neighbour's dog as his only companion. Although John later understood all his father and mother did was because they loved their son deeply and had high hopes for his future, he said he suffered from anxiety and terrible nightmares because of his ultra-religious childhood and his father's stories. John Sr. had a small blue scar on his forehead, which he said was the brand of Satan, and warned his son if he would ever sin, he would be marked too. When little John asked why his mother didn't have a similar mark, his father replied it was because Emily was an angel. John often lay in his bed thinking about things he had done with his hand on his forehead, wondering if he would wake up with a blue scar. But the blemish never appeared, no matter how much John misbehaved, which eventually made the boy believe he was invincible. Despite John Sr. describing his son as a good boy who never did anything wrong and got along well with other children, there were also quite different accounts. Some villagers remembered John as a little bully who would tweak little girls' ears and hit boys smaller than himself before running back into his own gate. One Wakefield resident recalled an incident with the young John. "One day, I was carrying my blazer over my arm when he came up behind me and snatched it away. Then he caught hold of my arm and threw my blazer right into the railway track. He was still holding me when he said, 'There is an express coming and it will run you over and cut you into little pieces, and there will be blood all over the place.' It was no use to try to speak to John's parents about their son's behaviour, as they were unapproachable. John Sr. was also a senior employee of the colliery and could cause serious trouble for people complaining about his precious child. At school, John was said to be not particularly popular, mischievous, but a fair scholar. He was a bright child, but academic life didn't really interest John. Still, he managed to win a scholarship to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Wakefield and another to Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy. At home, John learned the piano and was said to have played quite well. Others would gather to listen to him playing, but he would sometimes suddenly jump to his feet, slam down the piano lid, and walk off without saying a word. Due to his extreme reticence, nobody could really tell what was going on inside Haigh's head. After school, John took jobs in insurance and advertising, but soon realized his modest salary was insufficient for the lifestyle he wanted. John needed capital for numerous business ideas he had and eventually turned to fraud in order to make money fast. After being fired from his day job because of stealing from a cash box at the age of 21, John moved on to forging car documents. A couple of years later, in 1934, he married a woman named Beatrice Betty Hamer. But the union was short-lived as John's crimes caught up with him, and he was arrested and jailed for fraud. While her husband sat behind bars, Betty gave birth to a daughter she put up for adoption before deciding to end things with John. With his ultra-conservative family wanting nothing more to do with him, when John was released 2 years later, he left everything behind and moved to London. However, what John didn't leave and outward were his criminal tendencies. In London, Haigh worked as a chauffeur for William McSwan. McSwan was the owner of an amusement arcade, and Haigh would often use his background in engineering to fix McSwan's machines. Soon, John decided he wanted to move on to bigger, more illicit things. He set up a fake solicitor's office, and under the alias William Cato Adamson, Haigh began selling fraudulent stocks and shares, purportedly from the estates of his deceased clients. This particular scheme didn't last very long, as someone became suspicious after they noticed mistakes on a legal document. John was arrested again and sentenced to another 4 years for fraud. Though he would be released on license in 1940, he would spend many of the subsequent years in and out of prison. During his time inside, he concluded that the biggest flaw in his schemes was the fact that he'd left his victims alive and able to inform the authorities. If he wanted to continue defrauding people, John needed to devise a way to dispose of any witnesses to his crimes. With this in mind, he began to do research and eventually came across the crimes of George Alexandre Haigh. Haigh was a French murderer whose signature had been dissolving his victims in sulfuric acid. Inspired by the story, John experimented with mice and found that it took about 30 minutes for the small animal to dissolve entirely. Based on his findings, John calculated how much acid and time he would need for a full-grown person. He thought he had come up with a method for the perfect murder, believing that if there were no body, there would be no conviction. John was freed from prison once more in 1943 and worked for a while in a garage workshop, living with the owner, Alan Stevens, and his family. While living there, he would begin a relationship with the Stevens' 15-year-old daughter, Barbara. While visiting a pub in Kensington one evening, John spotted the familiar face of William McSwan. William was pleased to see his old friend and brought him along to meet with his parents, Donald and Amy. They spoke of how William had since sold his amusement business and was now making a substantial amount of money collecting rent from tenants who lived in his parents' London properties. Instead of being happy about his friend's success, John became envious of his lifestyle and saw the perfect opportunity to try out his gruesome murder plot. And so, after several more meetings with the McSwans, on September the 6th, 1944, Haigh lured William into a basement he rented on Gloucester Road. There, he beat him over the head with a metal bar before slitting his throat. In his diaries, Haigh wrote, "I got a mug and took some blood from his neck in the mug and drank it." After committing the murder, it's said that he left the body in the basement overnight before returning the next day to test his calculations for the first time. He removed all valuables from the body before forcing William's remains into a 40-gallon drum and then filling it with concentrated sulfuric acid. Haigh was then beaten back by the fumes and left the basement again. It took 2 days, but in the end, all that remained of William McSwan was black sludge, which John then poured down a manhole. After getting rid of William, John began living in his house and took over the rent-collecting duties, explaining to Donald and Amy that their son had run away to Scotland to avoid being drafted. Haigh maintained this illusion by travelling to Scotland and sending back postcards to the McSwans pretending to be their son. This worked for a while, but they became increasingly suspicious as the war began to draw to a close and their son remained in hiding. John, of course, had an easy solution for the situation. Just as he had done with William, he now lured Donald and Amy to Gloucester Road on July 2nd, 1945, killed them and dissolved their bodies in acid. By this stage, Haigh had incorporated a steel bathtub and breathing apparatus into his gruesome workshop. After the murders, John claimed the McSwans had travelled to the United States and fooled people into thinking he was working on their behalf. He managed to sell McSwan's properties and steal their pension cheques. With approximately £8,000 in his pocket, John moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington. The amount of money John stole from the McSwans was equivalent in purchasing power to about £408,000 today, and yet he was running short of money within a year. Because of his ever-worsening gambling problem, John was eventually forced to find more victims to kill and rob. In 1947, John pretended that he was interested in buying the house of a wealthy couple, Archibald and Rose Henderson. John told the Hendersons about his talents with piano and was soon invited to play for the couple's housewarming party in their new flat. During the party, John stole Archibald's revolver. As the Hendersons grew to trust Haigh, he was arranging for his body melting tools to be transported to a storehouse nearby on Leopold Road in Crawley. He had also ordered 2 more 40-gallon drums along with more acid. On February the 12th, 1946, Haigh drove Dr. Henderson to Crawley before shooting him in the head with his own revolver. He then placed his body in a storeroom, collected Rose, and did the same to her. He then set about dissolving their bodies. This time, however, not everything had been reduced to sludge by the time he returned. Rose's foot was left partially intact. By this stage, Haigh felt untouchable, and so, since the new workshop didn't have a drain, he simply poured the sludge along with the foot onto a pile of rubble at the back of the property. As before, he forged letters and sold possessions belonging to his victims, raising over £8,000. He even gifted some of Rose's dresses to Barbara Stevens, whom he was still seeing. When Rose's brother stated he was going to the police, Haigh told him that the couple had fled to South Africa after Archibald had performed an illegal abortion. John felt he could deal with anything thrown at him. Nobody was coming after him. There were no bodies to be found, nothing to connect him to the disappearances. Or so he thought. The ease of killing his victims may have given John a false sense of security. By February 1949, he found himself in financial trouble once again. He was late with his hotel bills and in debt to several commission agents. But then, a way out of his problems walked into his life in the form of a wealthy widow, a woman named Henrietta Olive Durand Deacon. Olive, who also lived in the Onslow Court Hotel, was a respectable and talented lady in her late 60s. One day, she happened to sit at the same table with John Haigh and was delighted to learn that her new acquaintance had worked in an engineering firm. Olive, you see, had an idea for artificial fingernails. Perhaps John could help her with it. Of course, before work could begin, it would be most prudent for Olive to tour John's workshop. And so Haigh was able to lure Olive down to his lair on February the 18th, 1949. As with the Hendersons, the widow was shot with the .38 caliber Webley revolver John had stolen from his previous victim before being placed into an acid bath. Within a couple of days, Olive's body was reduced to a mound of human sludge. However, this time, John had made a major mistake in selecting his victim. Olive's disappearance was almost immediately noticed by her friend Constance Lane, who was well aware of her plans to meet with a man named John Haigh. She informed the police, and their investigation soon revealed John's criminal background, immediately putting him under suspicion. While John tried to act helpful, pretending to be worried about the missing woman and giving interviews to reporters at the hotel, saying he hoped Mrs. Durand Deacon would be found safe and sound, the police headed out to raid his workshop in Crawley. It turned out John Haigh had not managed to make his victims disappear entirely. During the search, the investigators discovered several 40-gallon drums and containers of concentrated sulfuric acid alongside 28 pounds of human body fat, several gallstones, part of a left foot, 18 fragments of human bone, and upper and lower dentures, later revealed to have belonged to Olive. They also recovered a dry cleaner's receipt for Olive's coat and papers referring to the Hendersons and McSwans. John was arrested on February 26, 1949. But despite the amount of evidence against him, his sense of invincibility persisted. He told the detectives, "Mrs. Durand Deacon no longer exists. I have destroyed her with acid. You can't prove a murder without a body." John then proceeded to confess to the murders of the McSwans and the Hendersons, in addition to killing a young man called Max, a girl from Eastbourne, and a woman from Hammersmith. The 3 additional murders, however, could never be proven. But despite John's belief, the prosecution didn't need entire bodies for conviction. The trial was held on July the 18th and 19th, 1949 at Lewes Assizes. John pleaded not guilty based on insanity, claiming he was a vampire that drank the blood of his victims. John claimed that it had all stemmed from his nightmares when he was a little boy, stating, quote, "I saw before me a forest of crucifixes which gradually turned into trees. At first there appeared to be dew or rain dripping from the branches, but as I approached, I realized it was blood. The whole forest began to writhe, and the trees, dark and erect, to ooze blood. A man went from each tree catching the blood. When the cup was full, he approached me. 'Drink,' he said, but I was unable to move." End quote. No matter how disturbed John appeared, the insanity defense doesn't work if there are clear signs the defendant had acted with malice aforethought or premeditation. It was also revealed John had asked a curious question from a detective after his arrest. "Tell me frankly, what are the chances of anybody being released from Broadmoor?" Broadmoor is a high-security psychiatric hospital. Having admitted to the crimes and with his insanity defense falling apart, it took the jury only 17 minutes to return with a guilty verdict. And so, on August the 10th, 1949, John Haigh was hanged for his crimes at Wandsworth Prison. He was buried with his body intact, a simple act his victims had been denied. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, "Well, I never."